Time to elevate. You're running on empty with Matt and Tony.
Hey, everybody. Welcome to Running on Empty. I'm Matt.
And I'm Tony.
And we are running on empty. And looking forward to this today because we have a return guest to our show, Tony. And who might that be?
Yes, and we are thrilled to welcome back Gabe Loiacono. Welcome back, Gabe.
Thanks a lot. I'm really excited to be back.
All right. Gabe is an associate professor of history in the Department of History at University of Wisconsin Oshkosh. He's got his bachelor's from the University of California at Berkeley and a doctorate degree from Brandeis University. And we had him on our show in November where he talked about the origins of the Thanksgiving celebration in the colonies and then the United States. And at that time, he told us he was working on a book. And we said we'd have him out when his book came out. And the book has been released, and it's a really excellent one, folks. It's called How Welfare Worked in the Early United States, 5 Micro Histories, and it's published by Oxford University Press. And it's available on Amazon.com, and I'm sure other booksellers also. I looked through portions of it, and it is obviously an academic book, but it's also, Gabe, you write in a very, very readable style.
I'm glad to hear you say that, Tony. That was the goal.
Yeah. I don't. If anyone is worried that a book like this would be filled with academic lingo, I mean, you do obviously cite serious historians in your work and primary sources, but you do write in a way that the average everyday reading public would grasp. And I'm finding it fascinating. In fact, let me just read one quote from it. Gabe says, "The problem with our understanding of the history of welfare policy is that we so often imagine that welfare started in 1935 with the New Deal. Before then, so many Americans assume if people needed help from outside the family, then our neighbors, our friends, our churches would do it. As a result, many students, citizens, social workers, civil servants, policymakers, and historians work with a giant misunderstanding of the early American Republic." Absolutely. I mean, I have to just speak for me, Gabe. I mean, until your book, I didn't know that we had welfare in the United States and before 1935. But let's start with the title of your book. You're dealing with 5 micro histories. What's a micro history?
That's a big question despite the word micro. But essentially, my simple definition would be a very small history, a history of a particular place or a particular family, or in this case, of 5 people's lives as they relate to what early Americans called poor relief and what we usually call welfare.
Mm-hmm. And the 5 micro histories that you deal with all come from the state of Rhode Island.
Yes.
Why did you choose Rhode Island?
My question.
Yeah, it's a good question. It's the ocean state, but it's also a great place to find a lot of things that are happening in the early republic. It's got, urban seaport economies, rural economies. It's got lots of people of English ancestry, but also a significant number of people of African and indigenous ancestry, from the Narragansett Nation to the Nipmuc Nation and others. So there's a lot going on. And I found records of all of these people many years ago while I was doing research for my dissertation. And I chose Rhode Island for my dissertation because I could drive there and really focus on a small number of local archives, because this kind of research requires you to go from town to town and look in the records kept by local government, which in Rhode Island are mostly still in town and city halls.
Okay. And so even though you're dealing with your 5 microhistories deal with Rhode Island. Would you say that those 5 stories are representative of what would have been going on in all of the early states?
I would say that. In the introduction, I lay out a few differences that you can note. Rhode Island and the mid-Atlantic states probably warned out or banished people for a longer period than Massachusetts and perhaps some of the southern states. And obviously, the fact that slavery lasted much longer in the southern states makes a big difference to how poor relief worked. But otherwise, all states except Louisiana based their poor relief system on the Elizabethan Poor Law of England. And so at least as they started, these poor relief systems were structured the same way and worked similarly. Of course, they were locally administered, and every locality could do things a little bit differently.
Now, your book deals largely with the years from the 1790s to the 1850s.
Yes.
Here's one thing I learned, Gabe, that I was shocked when I read it, and I think that our listeners will be shocked. You say for the individual taxpayer in the 1790s to the 1850s, for the individual taxpayer, poor relief absorbed a larger portion of their tax payments than anything else.
Yeah, I would say
military, criminal justice, or until about 1830, schools and roads. How is that even possible?
Well, because there were virtually no federal taxes in this period, with a couple of exceptions. There were state and local taxes. And in the research that I've done, in not only in Rhode Island, but in other states, local taxes are much bigger than state taxes in this period. And you can look up what local governments spent their money on. And until 1830, poor relief is usually the biggest thing. And so that makes poor relief the biggest expense that a taxpayer is paying for.
So why has this been so hidden from us? Why have these narratives developed that we come from our ancestors were these rugged people who didn't need assistance? I think the narrative that has been promoted, especially over the last 30, 40 years, is that welfare is primarily a 20th century European invention and then got adopted in the US, as you say, in 1935 with the New Deal. How did this narrative get created that we never had welfare?
That's a really good question, Tony, and I don't know that I can totally answer. It's definitely a misconception. These early Americans were quite communal, and a lot of them were pretty rugged, and they did give charitably outside of government relief as well. But I would say that all charitable giving was just kind of icing on the cake in a way, an add-on to this core of government poor relief that every community depended on. And some places like New England were probably even more communal than other parts of the British colonies and the United States. But they all had this system. George Washington participated in doling out relief in his hometown. So they all did it. And I guess the other thing I would say is that for reasons I don't totally understand, historians of Britain talk a lot more about the history of poor relief and welfare than historians of the United States. There are just way more of them doing it. And so it's a bigger part of their understanding of history. We have some really good people working on it, but it's just, as you note, it's not a widely known story.
What's the with the stories? And again, I haven't read the book yet, and I'm looking forward to reading it. But what's the reasons the people were in the situation to need the poor relief?
Oh, that's a good question, and it could be anything, though it was frequently illness. Often, what caused people to need poor relief was, an injury or an illness, and this is a period when epidemics were sweeping through the United States, especially in big port towns, from the famous yellow fever of Philadelphia to other less noted epidemics that were happening all the time. So I would say that's a big one, and a death in the family could be another one. And some people were just, unable to work.
Sure. Gotcha.
And yet, was there any shame associated with it? Because again, in the modern period, if someone is quote unquote on welfare, it's generally kind of like a shame type of thing. I know that's not true in Europe and Canada, but here it is. Was that true back then also? That's
hard to answer. Going back to the English Elizabethan poor law, there is some shame built in. They even divide recipients of poor relief into quote worthy and quote unworthy poor.
Okay.
And in the colonial period, some local governments made recipients, or paupers as they were legally called, wear a badge that said they were, a pauper.
Oh, wow.
But, seriously, wow.
Yes, yeah. But in the early 19th century, the more I read these records, the more I thought, this is just a matter of course for people. I think there was often not a great deal of shame in receiving firewood or food or nursing care or cash.
Yeah. Well, Gabe, your book does have 5 major chapters, and each chapter is a micro history of a different person who was somehow involved in the welfare of the time. So let's deal with each individual chapter. So chapter 1 deals with a man named William Larned, who was apparently an overseer of the poor. So what is that? What was he?
Well, every town or county had an overseer of the poor, although in other states they sometimes went by different titles, but the position was always there. And this is an elected official, usually elected every year, whose job is to take care of all the people from the town who need help, and also to identify anyone in town who might need help, but is not from the town and therefore is not legally entitled to this poor relief. So that's why I like to compare them to the old Roman god Janus of the two faces, because the overseer has a very merciful face for people who are from town and need help, and kind of a harsh face towards people who might be banished or warned out from the town.
What would someone like William Larned have done to have attained this position as overseer of the poor?
How do you get that job?
you just need to throw your name in and be elected by the town property holders. In Rhode Island they were called the freemen, and he did that in 1792, and he was reelected every year except one until he died in 1828.
Wow,
it's amazing.
It is, yeah. And that's how I found Larned. Is I just kept coming across this guy's name. And at first I wasn't really interested in him. I was interested in the people that he was either helping or warning out. But when I just kept finding the same name over and over again, I thought, there's a story here. He has an unusually long career as an overseer.
Well, apparently one of William Larned's powers was the power to banish people from a community. And he did that apparently with the subject of chapter 2 of your book, who is Cuff Roberts.
That's right.
Cuff Roberts was banished by Larned. So what did Cuff Roberts do to get banished?
Well, all he did was move from his hometown of Coventry, Rhode Island, to Providence, Rhode Island, by then the biggest town. And that alone gave Larned the legal right to recommend that the town council banish him if Larned thought, and the town council agreed, that Roberts might need poor relief in the future. So these were preemptive banishments.
Wow.
Yeah.
So, I mean, could he have just gone back home, or, I mean, like to his other place?
He was supposed to go home, whether he had a house there or not. But the logic of the poor relief system was that everyone, in theory, had a hometown who had to, and they used this word literally, own them, meaning like take care of them and provide for them in their time of need.
Got it.
But Roberts Larned was instrumental in banishing a lot of people. Roberts, though, was part of kind of a sweep of Providence, and this happened not only in Providence, but in other New England towns, where local officials decided all of a sudden that they wanted to warn out as many African Americans as they could. And Cuff Roberts and his wife and 4 children were the first names in a sweep in 1806 that William Larned was instrumental in.
You used the phrase "worn out."
Yes.
WARN.
That's the technical term for this banishment.
Okay,
Wow.
where does that term come? Yeah, where does that term come from? Worn out.
I think it comes from the Elizabethan Poor Laws originally, but that's how the Poor Laws are written. The power of what I call banishment, so we understand it, is called warning out by them.
You know, Gabe, you've referred several times to the Elizabethan impact,
Yes.
right? Now,
Yeah.
and this has always been a little bit confusing to me. So we fought a revolution to break away from England.
Yeah.
And yet we see all of this European influence.
Yeah.
How do you explain that?
Well, the more you think about it, the more it makes sense. If these British colonies were replicating England, they were little Englands in some ways, and they just adopted English laws wholesale.
Okay.
When the American Revolution came, it didn't change everything. In some ways, life had to go on, even if the imperial government was being ultimately defeated and thrown out. But what carried on as normal, by and large, were local governments. They kind of just did what they had always done, including electing overseers of the poor and town councils. And especially in New England, local governments tended to be patriot. They tended to be against the crown.
Okay.
And they would kind of just lead their town right through this giant upheaval by using these old laws. Most states wrote a new constitution around the American Revolutionary War to make new state laws, but they often would just keep the laws that were working for them and rewrite them back into state statutes.
All right, that's fascinating. Now, all right, so you talked about Cuff Roberts, who was banished by Larned, but then your chapter 3, your microhistory in that chapter deals with One-Eyed Sarah, who was a beneficiary of William Larned. So how did she benefit from him?
She was a beneficiary, and she also helped Larned help others. And I wish I knew Sarah's name. I only know her by the title she's given in newspapers, which is One-Eyed Sarah.
Do you know how she got the name One-Eyed Sarah?
And I don't know for sure how she got the name One-Eyed Sarah. Though in the chapter, I explore 2 possibilities, 2 Sarahs that totally could be her, but I can't for sure prove which one is her. But nevertheless, you can get a really unusual insight into how overseers helped people by looking at how Larned paid Sarah to nurse people who were, at least on a few occasions, on their deathbed back to health at the public expense.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's really cool, actually.
It is. So Sarah's by no means alone, but Sarah made money from this deal, right? She supported herself essentially as what I call a local government relief contractor. And she obviously benefited others tremendously. And this is, I think, one reason why the Poor Laws were so popular for so long, is that they benefited people who were really in need, but they also benefited all the people who helped those in need, from nurses to grocers to doctors to day laborers who would split firewood. All of these people could be paid by the town to help the neediest.
What would be the equivalent of a One-Eyed Sarah today?
That's a great question. We do have nurses who work in a public health department, in a, say, our county public health department here in Oshkosh. But unlike those nurses, Sarah doesn't have a regular salary. She's kind of paid ad hoc.
So one of the reasons why William Larned would he run for office like what, every 2 years, every 4 years?
Every year.
Every
Oh,
year.
annual.
Every
Wow.
summer. Yeah.
All right. So the fact that he kept getting elected meant that people were satisfied with how he was administering these programs.
Yeah, and you get at a great thing. There's two things that the overseers have to do to be reelected. They have to be seen as providing good, humane care, but they also are expected to keep the costs down as much as can be expected, right?
Can we adopt a system like today? I'm just, seriously.
Well, it's not perfect.
No.
And I would say that this old problem we still have, right? How do you do something well and cheaply at the same time? And that's the dilemma of early American poor relief.
Exactly. Well, your chapter 4 microhistory deals with someone known as Lydia Bates. What should we know about Lydia Bates?
Well, Lydia Bates helps us learn a number of things. One is how poor relief worked in really small rural towns like hers, Scituate, Rhode Island. And another is how it affected children. Lydia Bates was a pauper herself as a child. And then she had a daughter named Rhoda out of wedlock. And we can learn a lot about how overseers of the poor responded to women in general, and in particular, unmarried mothers in this chapter. It's a fascinating story. One of the things that surprised me most is that it seems that the local overseers found a way to take care of Lydia Bates from youth onwards like this. They would arrange for her a temporary job at a farmer's house, and she would do all sorts of things from agricultural work to shirt mending to housekeeping. And she would stay there a few months at a time in return for room and board. And in some cases, she was treated almost like one of the family. But she did not have a long-term situation. She kind of moved around a lot and had this, it turns out, really boisterous social life that is well documented because the overseers of the poor really wanted to know who Rhoda's father was, because the poor laws required them to pursue child support and not allow the Scituate taxpayers to pay for Rhoda's care if they could find the father. And the father, Lydia Bates consistently named a traveling salesman named Thomas T. Hill as the father. Hill took this case to the Supreme Court of Rhode Island 3 times and thus generated tons of records for historians like me to look at.
Wow.
Yeah.
What was the general consensus for unmarried women at the time with regards to maybe needing, help? I mean, her case was definitely unique, but was that consistent amongst a lot of the other folks that might have been in her situation?
Yeah, overseers, that's a great question, Matt, because overseers assumed that an unmarried mother was gonna need help, was gonna be a pauper. And that's why they kind of moved in right away. Before Rhoda was even born, they were interviewing Lydia Bates and trying to get things set up so that they could start paying her expenses. Well, they were already paying her expenses, and then start paying Rhoda's and pursue Thomas T. Hill like as soon as they could.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. That's
I'm sorry, Matt, go ahead.
No, that's go ahead. That was good.
People like Lydia Bates and even One-Eyed Sarah, Gabe, if they're in poverty at that time, what were their roads out of poverty? I mean, women, correct me if I'm wrong, could not go to school at that time, correct?
Well,
definitely not to university.
No, not to university. And certainly for a woman from a poorer family like Lydia Bates, there weren't many roads. There was, of course, marriage. And I think part of her story is her goals and what she wants to do and how she might find a husband, or just the kind of work that she does. Sarah has actually a better situation because she's earning cash from the overseer of the poor for her nursing work.
Okay. Who would have taken care of Lydia's daughter, Rhoda, while Lydia was working on the farm or other tasks? Did they have
Yeah,
like a daycare?
well, no. The one of the, I think for us, the most disturbing parts of poor relief in that period is how frequently parents and children would be separated from each other.
Okay.
Rhoda seems to stay with Lydia Bates, her mom, until about age 7 or 8. And then the overseers of the poor intervene and put her in another house. So often children of poor parents are just taken from their parents and put into another household. That may have happened to Sarah as well. This could happen as young as the age of 3. And we know, too, that New England town officials targeted African-American and indigenous children especially, but really poor children of English ancestry could also be separated from their parents.
They weren't separated permanently, were they? I mean, it wasn't a permanent situation. I mean, they could go over and see him, or no? Is that?
That's a good question, and that's hard to figure out from the records.
Okay.
But it could be permanent until age 18 for girls, 21 for boys.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
Well, Gabe, your 5th microhistory deals with a William, is it Fales?
Yeah, I believe that's how you pronounce his name.
Okay, William Fales, who apparently was isolated in a poorhouse.
Yeah, interestingly,
well,
William Fales was born the same year as Rhoda, the daughter in chapter 4, but he doesn't suffer this illness until later on. He suffers from a kind of a rheumatoid arthritis that by the age of 20-something means he can't get out of bed. But he's a really smart guy. He's really thoughtful. He's a very devout Christian. And so he writes down what he's thinking while he's in this poorhouse in another town in Rhode Island, Portsmouth, Rhode Island, that gives us a real glimpse, an unusually good glimpse from an insider's perspective of what poorhouses are like. And poorhouses had existed for a long time, but they became much more popular in the mid-19th century. The theory was they were going to be the ticket to cheap and humane care. It didn't totally work that way, but that's why taxpayers were willing to invest a lot of money in building these or buying poorhouses.
So were the poorhouses like in like some well-designated part of town where people would know that's where the poorhouse is?
Everyone would know, where the poorhouse was.
Right.
Sometimes they were usually on the outskirts of town.
Sure.
In the case of Newport, Rhode Island, literally on an island that was inaccessible except by boat.
Wow.
So literally isolated. In the case of William Fales, he was visited by a local wealthy retired guy who took an interest in him. And that guy, called Shepherd Tom Hazard, said that Fales's poorhouse was just inaccessible. It was hard to get to. It was sort of all by itself. And that was not always the case, but often the case that these places were, remote farms.
Were these poorhouses, Gabe, like roughly similar to modern, warming shelters and things that we have today?
They could be. They were intended to be longer term, so that you would live there. And many of them had rules that you couldn't leave. Another historian of poor relief in America, Dave Wagner, has made the argument that a lot of today's institutions are like poorhouses in many ways, and I think he would include prisons in that in that category. But they're ideally supposed to be happy, prosperous, clean places to live. The hope was that inmates of a poorhouse would do farm work to support the poorhouse and ultimately pay their own way. The problem with that, of course, is that William Fales and lots of other people like him are there precisely because they can't work. And
Sure.
Right.
so that doesn't always work out.
I guess the term halfway house is something that I've heard. So is that similar, to what this might be? It'd be kind of like
that is also comparable.
Okay.
I think, I think, for people who it seems aren't, the idea is that they're not quite able to live independently,
Right.
but, somewhat independently. Definitely there are people in that category living in poor houses in the 19th century.
Gotcha.
Your book stops in the 1850s. I mean, do we start to get dramatic changes in all of this after the 1850s?
Well, a couple of things happen, and the epilogue zooms through that history. We're taking it right up to the present.
Right.
But essentially, poor relief becomes a lot more politically controversial in the mid-19th century. And I think that has a lot to do with the controversies about immigration in that period, with immigrants from Ireland and the German states in particular starting to come in big numbers. The other thing that happens is state governments start to get more involved in what had almost entirely been local government work in that period. And then, of course, and famously, we kind of circle back to where we started this conversation in the 1930s. The Great Depression, I think it's fair to say, overwhelms local poor relief.
Sure.
And kind of local poor relief administrators often make a plea to states, and state governments make a plea to the national government to help. And then we get these big national interventions like the Social Security Act.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, Gabe, when we look back on this period that you've dealt with from the 1790s to the 1850s, in terms of how the United States dealt with poverty, is this something that today we should be proud of? Is this something we should be ashamed of?
I think it's a mixed answer, and that's a great question, and I've thought about this a lot. I think we would not want to do banishment or warning out again in the way that they did. I think we'd be uncomfortable with how quickly they separated parents and children. But on the flip side, they theoretically guaranteed everyone that they would have enough food and shelter and even healthcare and firewood to live in their hometown. And they also did this by paying neighbors to help neighbors. And that does seem, at least to me, a bit attractive, right? That this was a popular system precisely because the town pooled its resources to help neighbors help neighbors. So there were some guarantees there. It didn't always work smoothly. There were certainly abuses, but there was, I think, something to admire as well.
Gabe, one thing I've heard about the Civil War is that it's a myth that the North wanted to go and fight the Civil War to end slavery, in part because we know this from your book, right? The North had a serious poverty issue. I mean, is that one of the reasons why Lincoln said that the Civil War is about keeping the Union together rather than to free slaves?
Well, he certainly said that at first, although I think the interesting thing about Lincoln is he changes his mind, which is huge. But absolutely, the question of how to include formerly enslaved people into the poor relief system is a big question. It's a big question when northern states abolished slavery during the American Revolution, and that is part of chapter 2 on Cuff Roberts. And it's also a big question when southern states are required to abolish slavery at the end of the Civil War.
Wow, what a fascinating history, Gabe, that you've given us here. And do you think that what you discover in this book, how should it inform? How should your work inform our current discussions about welfare?
That's a great question, Tony, and I don't have answers to some of the big complicated questions of today's welfare system, but I think it is important to know, as you said at the beginning of our talk, that it existed, that welfare has always existed in the United States. There was no period in which welfare didn't exist.
Right.
And I think, there are some lessons here about what in the past we want to avoid and what maybe we want to recover. And what has worked, what have been the constant questions and problems. This tension between humanity and expense has been around for a long time.
Yeah.
We've seen some experiments that looked really promising, like poorhouses, didn't turn out quite as well as hoped. And so I think there's a lot to learn here. And, just more broadly, I think we today are living in a world shaped by the people who came before us. And so understanding how they shaped this world, what the world that they lived in was like, I think is necessary to understanding our world.
Well, I think a book like yours is really important because a lot of students today, if they're not necessarily, interested in a lot of the history of the United States and they just kind of move forward from where they are, a lot of people think that, welfare just showed up. I mean, especially in a state like Wisconsin, it used to be a big welfare state, and it was all of a sudden it was here without any historical precedent. And to have them realize that there is actually a really good intention and compassion in a system like this, without that kind of shame, and it's turned into this kind of bad thing. And I would love to be able to get away from that again. Are there any insights maybe as to what, like ideas that we could potentially return to that did work, that we could kind of carry forward with our current system?
Yeah, I think involving people more in the government help of our neighbors might be a way to do that. And certainly to know that it's not un-American to have welfare, in the sense that it's always been
exactly.
There. I think those are two things that I think we could take away from these stories to help us think about today's welfare system.
It sounds like there was more of an expectation that people will simply need help, right? There will be times times in life when you'll need help. And I think that in Europe and in Canada, they still have that mindset, right? That if you're on, what do they call it? The dole. If you're on the dole, it's nothing to be ashamed about. There's a point in your life where you might need that. When did the whole shaming of poverty start to happen in this country?
Well, I think there was always that element. And I think it was built in from the 16th century into the Elizabethan Poor Laws. But it seems to me that the periods of great controversy around welfare have also been periods of immigration and periods when, somewhat homogeneous communities became less homogeneous. And I think there's often some adjustment to understanding us and them and who we're taking care of when we take care of people.
Great.
I think that's part of it.
Great. Gabe, this has been a really fascinating discussion of your really wonderful book. This is, I think, a very important contribution to the discussion of poverty in America. And I do hope it gets a national discussion. I mean, you would agree, I'm sure, that the pandemic year, 2020, 2021, has really brought the issue of poverty and how to deal with it into much greater focus, has it not?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think it's really put a magnifying glass on our needs. And I really appreciate, Matt and Tony, your having me and talking with me about this book. It's been a lot of fun for me.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
This is great. Thank you so much, Gabe.
Thank you.
Hey, Tony, I really enjoyed this. And I know I say that a lot, but this is brain food for me, man. I love being able to, and what's really cool is the fact that I'm actually at UW Oshkosh as we record this particular show. So like 30 years later, it finally comes full circle.
A lifelong learner. At
Yeah,
work. That's
yeah.
really
I'm hoping to get my degree soon. No, but no, this was good. I love Gabe, and I really think people should take a look at this book, because it's going to give them insight as to stuff they probably didn't even know. I mean, most people would be completely oblivious to something like this unless it was brought up. And so hopefully this inspires some folks to actually go back and take a look at the history of this in our country.
I think so. I think Gabe Loiacono, Dr. Loiacono, has just written a very important work of scholarship here to really move the discussion forward on the issue of poverty. I think what has held us back in this country is this demonization of the word welfare.
Yeah.
And part of the way that we get over that is by showing how it's always been there in various incarnations.
Yeah.
What a tremendous public service Gabe is providing by exposing that. And, it's an example of the kind of scholarship that goes on a campus like University of Wisconsin Oshkosh. I'm really proud to be associated with it.
What I like about it is it shows the humanity in our country. I really like that, because a lot of times when you hear the term welfare, the humanity of that gets lost because there's that shaming, right?
Yeah.
And it turns out that people just wanted to help other people. And with the divide we have in this country now, we definitely need some help. Yeah. And I think this is, he's definitely trying. It's a good first step. I mean, this is what he's into, and that's what he teaches. But this is incredible that it's now, essentially for the rest of the world to see.
Yeah, and I like the way he shows in that time period, that roughly 60-year time period, the parts of it that were progressive, that were compassionate, and the parts of it that really were inhumane, like the child separation type of policies.
Yeah, not a big fan of that.
The idea that the woman would have her child taken away from her at the age of 7 and maybe not see her again until she was 18, or maybe not at all.
Right.
Right. Yeah. That was the part that was really kind of horrifying. But overall, he does teach us that there certainly was not any ignoring of poverty at the time. There were efforts to deal with it. And it's interesting that today at the local level of government, I've served on a city council. Today, it's hard to even discuss poverty at the local level.
Yeah.
So many local officials don't even want to deal with it. They say, oh, that's the state's issue. That's the Fed's issue. No, it's our issue locally. So
definitely a local issue. So, well, hopefully we'll be able to have Gabe back again. I love our conversations, and I just love learning from him. So looking forward to that in the future.
And until next time, Matt, let's once again remind everyone to stay elevated.
Stay elevated, everybody. We'll see you next time.
Running on Empty with Matt and Tony.
That show that we just did, Matt.
Yeah.
That's the kind of thing that we need to get to National Public Radio.
Yeah.